In this section, we'll look at the 1972 election and Nixon's campaign to win a second term. When it came to the Democratic primary, it was a real crowded field. There was Hubert Humphrey, the Minnesota senator who had run unsuccessfully for the Democrats in 1968. There was Maine Senator Edmund Muskie, who was known as a real champion of environmental policy, and I'd mentioned him earlier in regard to the environmental policies Nixon had. There was Henry Jackson from Washington State, a senator with a moderate record. And there's even an African-American woman, Shirley Chisholm, who was running and became the first woman to run a campaign for a major party nomination. And also I should add that there was George Wallace, the former Alabama governor, who was still running on a platform to fight desegregation. And he'd run as an independent in 1968, but in 1972 he's going to try to win the Democratic nomination. So it was a real crowded race. It also proved in a real momentous campaign. George Wallace was actually shot and paralyzed at a campaign stop in Laurel, Maryland, and that sort of removed him from the process. Muskie's campaign imploded with the dirty tricks from the Nixon campaign. They issued a fake letter the Nixon people had that became known as the Canuck letter, and basically it tarred Muskie's wife, saying that she was an alcoholic, and Muskie, standing on a flatbed truck in the snow, got so emotional he began to cry. And back in those days, a president crying was a sign of weakness, and so Muskie's campaign sort of went away. Out of this confusion came South Dakota Senator George McGovern as the Democratic nominee, and McGovern was was from the left side of the party. He was advocating just a withdrawal from Vietnam quickly, and he was sort of the peace candidate. He was very liberal in his policies and just wanted the United States to pull out of Vietnam quickly to cut our losses. The Muskie campaign got a real problem as the campaign went on as well, because Muskie picked as his running mate Thomas Eagleton. And it turns out the media reported that Eagleton had been treated for depression. And unlike today, when people are a little more knowledgeable, that was a disqualifying thing. People just thought, well, he's crazy. And so Eagleton had to pull out, and Muskie picked another candidate to run with him, Sergeant Shriver. But this was right before the general election, and so the Muskie campaign was sort of in disarray. Of course, the campaign had the famous October surprise, as I'd mentioned in an earlier video on the Vietnam War. Only days before the election, Nixon's foreign policy advisor, Henry Kissinger, who had been negotiating peace terms with North Vietnam, announced publicly that an armistice had been reached. And he said, I believe peace is at hand. And as I say, this spawned the political phrase October surprise. But, if the war were over with and they'd had an armistice, it made it seem like Nixon had done what a lot of the peaceniks had said was impossible. And McGovern was running just to pull out. It kind of discredited McGovern. And so the result was one of the most overwhelming landslides in American political history. Nixon won over 60% of the popular vote, which is a complete romp. You have, of course, during the 1972 campaign, the beginning of Watergate scandal, which will be discussed in a later video, but the 1972 election was a tremendous victory for Nixon, and he anticipated 4 more years. Of course, again, the roots of the Watergate scandal were during this election. This includes the section on the 1972 election.